Have you ever tried to decipher something that seemed designed specifically to drive you crazy? Well, yes. My name is John Spencer, and this story began with a simple envelope left under my door. No signature, no notice, just a string of numbers. 7 digits that completely changed the way I see truth and life. That night, I didn't know I was accepting an invitation to a deadly game. A game of logic, revenge, and obsession, where every mistake cost a life, and every success brought me closer to the killer, and to myself. Because in the end, a criminal's mind can be the most faithful mirror of what we hide within our own conscience. As I deciphered the numbers, I realized they didn't just predict deaths, they told stories. Stories that time tried to erase, but that came back to exact a price. And between each calculation and silence, I began to understand that the real mystery wasn't the killer. It was the motive. So before I open this case with you, I want to know, where are you watching this investigation from? Tell me in the comments. Maybe I've already solved a case nearby. Or worse, maybe one is still ongoing. I've never been one to believe in coincidences. But that night, something made me doubt the logic that had always guided me. I was alone in my office, the clock ticking every second as if trying to warn me of something. Then I heard the subtle slip of paper under the door. A manila envelope with no return address. Inside, just a sheet of paper folded in 4 and a sequence of numbers that seems alive. I ran my fingers over the digits like someone touching an old wound. 12, 07, 23, 19, 45. There were no letters, no signature, nothing that said, "This is a threat." But the silence between the digits screamed. My instinct told me this wasn't a simple joke. And if I've learned anything in these years of investigation, it's that evil rarely presents itself loudly. It arrives quietly, like an indecent invitation to a game you didn't ask to play. I grabbed my notebook, jotted down the numbers, and tried to find a pattern. They could be coordinates, dates, times, or just a test. But the most curious thing was the weight of that paper. It seemed to carry more than ink and cellulose, as if it held the intention of someone who knew my very thoughts. And it was at that moment that I felt that old shiver down my neck, the same one I get when I'm about to discover something that will change everything. I left the envelope on the table, took a deep breath, and looked out the window. The city seemed asleep, but I knew that somewhere, someone was watching. The night sometimes has eyes, and I was about to face them, unaware that this simple set of numbers would be the beginning of the most enigmatic case of my career. The next morning, the phone rang before sunrise. On the other end, Sergeant Miller's tense voice shattered my brief respite. "Spencer, we have a scene. You better come." 10 minutes later, I was in the car, the envelope still on the passenger seat. Something inside me told me to take it. When I arrived, the distant sound of sirens seemed to echo along with the number I'd read the night before. 1207 23 1945. The victim was a woman in her early 30s, with no signs of forced entry, no apparent struggle. On her wrist, a bracelet engraved with the date, 120723. Coincidence? I don't believe it. The living room clock, broken, read exactly 7:45 p.m. And that's when my stomach dropped. The numbers on the envelope weren't just symbols. They were a timeline. Someone was calculating lives. While the forensics team worked, I stood there observing the body. There was something about the way everything was left, clean, precise, almost mathematical. The killer wasn't just planning, he was programming. And the message was clear. The next number was already being written somewhere. It was at that moment that I realized the game was about to begin. A game of logic, blood, and time. I picked up the envelope again and stared at the sequence. Each number seemed to pulse, as if trying to tell me something I couldn't yet hear. The investigation had officially begun, but deep down, a feeling told me this was personal, and that the killer already knew my next move. I returned to the office, my head spinning. I spread photos, reports, and notes across the desk, trying to make sense of that damned sequence. The numbers seemed to dance before me, changing shape every time I blinked. Years of investigation had taught me that everything has a pattern, even chaos. Only in this case, the pattern seemed to be hidden on purpose, as if the killer himself wanted to test me. I returned to the office, my head spinning. I spread photos, reports, and notes across the desk, trying to make sense of that damned sequence. The numbers seemed to dance before me, changing shape every time I blinked. Years of investigation had taught me that everything has a pattern, even chaos. Only in this case, the pattern seemed to be hidden on purpose, as if the killer himself wanted to test me. I grabbed a ruler, drew lines, and connected dates, times, and coordinates. No concrete results. Until I noticed something curious. The numbers followed a logic of intervals, not order. The killer wasn't choosing his victims randomly. He was following a progression, as if there were a formula behind the killing. And the more I looked, the more I realized he was leaving me clues, like a teacher proud of his favorite student. I spent hours analyzing the sequences. At one point, fatigue set in, and I closed my eyes for a moment. Then a memory came to me, an old case in which the criminal used codes based on broken clocks, symbols of time he believed he could control. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Could I be dealing with someone who had studied my old reports? I wrote everything down, drew arrows, and scribbled down possibilities. But one idea kept echoing in my mind. What if the numbers didn't just show when the crime would happen, but where? The thought chilled me, because if this hypothesis were correct, the next body already had an address. 3 days later, the story was all over the news. Sensational headlines, absurd theories, and a flood of anonymous emails. But one caught my attention. The sender used the codename Watcher09, and the subject line simply said, "Let's see if you're as good as they say." The body of the message contained another numerical sequence and a sentence that made me freeze. Decipher my numbers and save the next one. At that moment, the game stopped being an investigation and became a duel. He didn't want to hide. He wanted to be seen, admired, challenged. The mastermind behind these murders had a narcissistic streak, but with an almost scientific precision. It was as if each crime were an experiment, and I was his lab rat. The difference was that I knew how to play, and he would end up trapped inside the very maze he created. The message spread through the press before I could even control it. Suddenly, the entire country was watching the countdown to the next code, turning the tragedy into a spectacle. Social media was in a frenzy, each person trying to decipher the numbers on their own. The killer had gotten what he wanted, attention. But I knew that behind this spectacle lay a much darker plan. That night, I stared at the computer screen, the sequence flashing like a warning. Each digit seemed to challenge me personally, as if to say, "You're not as smart as you think, Spencer." And deep down, maybe he was right, because I still had no idea that the next number was already in motion. By this point, I had enough material to begin building the killer's profile. He was methodical, rational, obsessed with patterns and symmetry. He didn't act on impulse. He planned every detail like a mental engineer. Someone with above-average intelligence, but emotionally unstable. A brilliant mind with a warped sense of justice. And most intriguingly, he seemed to understand the psychology of fear better than many experts I've interviewed. I spent the night analyzing his messages. The words were measured, almost surgical, without slang, without errors, but with a provocative tone. He wanted dialogue. He wanted to be deciphered. His choice of victims showed a moral pattern behind his crimes. They all had something to hide: hidden scandals, discreet corruption, small faults that never came to light. He didn't kill for pleasure. He killed with purpose. As I wrote the report, I found myself wondering if he truly believed he was delivering justice. That was the worst part about rational killers. They see themselves as heroes. In their minds, spilling blood is a necessary sacrifice. And this perception makes them nearly impossible to predict. Because how do you negotiate with someone who thinks they're saving the world? I closed the file and looked at the board full of photos, red lines, and dates. Everything seemed to fit, but something was still missing. There was a blind spot, a detail hidden amidst the perfect logic. And when a killer thinks logically, it's in the irrational that he leaves his traces. Inside the police station, the atmosphere had changed. The case had become so widespread that even those who had never believed in coincidences began to question everything. Some colleagues thought the messages were the work of a copycat, a lunatic seeking fame. Others said it was just a random sequence that happened to coincide with the crimes. But I sensed there was something much deeper behind it, something that cold logic alone couldn't explain. As everyone discussed probabilities and theories, I watched their faces. Fear and skepticism walked hand in hand. I've seen many investigators lose their way trying to find meaning where there was none. But in this case, the meaning existed, and it was screaming for all to hear. The killer wasn't just playing with numbers. He was playing with our perception of truth. And that, to me, was more dangerous than any weapon. I remember the exact moment the argument exploded. One of the detectives, irritated, threw the reports on the table and said, "Spencer, maybe you're seeing too much." And I replied, "Or maybe you're seeing too little." The room fell silent. No one wanted to admit it, but the case was already affecting all of us. Because when the mind tries to decipher the indecipherable, it begins to fragment. That night, as I left the building, I noticed something curious. A car parked across the street, headlights off. I pretended not to notice and kept walking, but deep down I knew. Sometimes the enemy isn't ahead, it's all around, just watching, waiting for the next wrong move. I returned home late that night, my head throbbing between coffee and paranoia. I spread the photos and codes out on the kitchen table again, the same ritual I performed in every case. Only this time, the pattern seemed to be playing tricks on me. Until, amidst the scribbles and notes, I realized something simple, almost obvious. The sequences weren't random. They formed groups of 3, and each group could be converted into geographic coordinates. It was as if the killer had shined a flashlight into my mental darkness. I ran to the computer, opened the map, and entered the numbers. The marked spot was in an industrial area, decommissioned for years, on the outskirts of the city. A forgotten place, perfect for those who want to be remembered in the worst possible light. And the more I analyzed, the clearer it became. The killer was leading me there. He wanted me to go to that spot. It was an invitation, and I accepted. I went to the spot accompanied only by my flashlight and a nagging doubt. Why would he leave something so explicit? Once there, the silence was thick, heavy. On the ground, among the dust and rust, I found a symbol drawn in chalk. The same number from the last sequence, surrounded by a spiral. There was no body, no blood, just the feeling that I had arrived too early or too late. Back in the car, I opened the envelope again. The numbers now seemed to form a trail, not a warning. He was building something, a story written in coordinates and calculated deaths. And somehow, I was already a part of it. The next morning, the atmosphere at the station was tense. The commander decided to act based on the coordinates I'd found. They set up a full operation, patrol cars, drones, forensics, everything. It was the kind of move the press loved, and the kind of mistake clever killers expect. I warned them the code might have more than one layer, but no one would listen. This time, Spencer, you'll see that your genius can make mistakes too, Sergeant Miller said, half jokingly, half teasingly. We arrived at the site and surrounded the warehouse. Everything seemed too quiet, too clean. When we opened the main door, I noticed the metallic smell of deception. In the center of the warehouse, there was an empty chair, a projector on, and, on the wall, a new number sequence projected. The message blinked calmly, as if mocking us. A new code, and a timer below. 30 seconds. I yelled for everyone to leave, but the noise came first. A controlled explosion, calculated not to kill, only to wound pride. The killer didn't want victims at that moment. He wanted to prove a point. The mistake was ours. And in that instant, I realized he'd been one step ahead all along. The warehouse was a symbolic trap, a mirror of the game itself. He created the equation, and we fell into it. Outside, amid the smoke and debris, I looked up at the cloudy sky and felt anger mixed with fascination. This wasn't just a killer. This was an architect of chaos, someone who transformed logic into art. And now, after that masterstroke, I knew he was just getting started. I spent the next few days immersed in old reports, trying to find something that connected the victims. Each of them lived in different worlds: lawyers, professors, business people, people with no apparent connection. But a killer's logic is never obvious. I began combing through public records, financial transactions, archived cases, and it was there, among dusty papers, that the truth began to emerge. All the victims had one thing in common. They were involved, directly or indirectly, in a corruption case that had been hushed up 10 years earlier. The case had gone unnoticed at the time, an investigation halted, names erased, evidence lost. I remember it well, because I myself had been part of that operation. At the time, we hadn't been able to conclude anything. Evidence was lacking, and political pressure was enormous. Now I realized someone had decided to bring justice their own way, and each death was a retroactive sentence written in blood instead of ink. The more I connected the dots, the clearer the logical structure of the crimes became. The killer wasn't killing random people. He was rewriting the past, eliminating one by one those responsible for a collective error. It was as if he believed himself to be the moral corrector of a broken system. But this pursuit of justice, disguised as calculation, was what made him even more dangerous. Because someone who kills on purpose rarely stops. I closed the file and stared at the map of the victims spread out on the table. The red lines formed a strange, almost symmetrical pattern, as if it wanted to show me something hidden in the pattern of connections. A detail screamed out from between the photos, but I still couldn't see it. It was like trying to decipher a code written with my own conscience. The more I studied that pattern, the more a question tormented me. How far can justice be distorted before it becomes revenge? The killer didn't seem to act out of hatred, but conviction. In each crime, there was an implicit message, a cold calculation of balance. He didn't just take lives, he corrected ethical equations, as if the world were a chessboard where every human error merited exact punishment. And this logic began to affect me. I spent the night awake, thinking about how many times the law failed, how many guilty people got away with it due to lack of evidence. Was he simply doing what we couldn't? This doubt gnawed at me. I, who had always been guided by reason, was beginning to feel the weight of morality like a maze with no exit. Because, deep down, who defines what is right or wrong when the truth is manipulated on all sides? As I stared at the photos of the victims, I noticed something disconcerting. Each one had a serene, almost peaceful expression, as if they knew their end was deserved. It was a feeling that disturbed me. No killer should be admired, but that man's precision, the way he calculated justice, left me torn between revulsion and respect. What else could he possibly justify? I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. In the silence of the office, I heard the ticking of the clock, marking the time remaining until the next crime. And it was in that instant that I understood. The real enigma wasn't the numerical code, but the moral dilemma it planted within me. And this, perhaps, was the hardest to decipher. The discovery happened almost by chance. During a sweep of one of the crime scenes, one of the agents found an old notebook hidden behind a false wall. The pages were covered with calculations, diagrams, and encrypted Bible verses. I picked up the diary and felt its weight. It wasn't just a record, it was the killer's mental map. And each page felt like a distorted mirror of my own thinking. The numbers were arranged like formulas, followed by enigmatic notes. Every error has a price. The mathematics of the soul is exact. Truth is the only prime number. It was a type of reasoning that blended faith and logic, science and redemption. The author was no lunatic. He had a philosophy of his own. And this blend of rationality and mysticism made it all the more dangerous. He didn't kill just to punish. He believed he was purifying. I spent hours deciphering the passages. Each page led to another, like an endless series of mental labyrinths. At one point, I found something that froze me. A note dated 10 years ago, during the same period as the corruption case. And there was a name crossed out, hard, repeatedly. A name I knew well. Mine. Spencer. The pen had nearly pierced the paper. I calmly closed the diary and looked around, trying to hide my agitation. If this man was writing about me even before the murders began, it meant one thing. I wasn't just investigating the killer. I was part of his story, and perhaps his plan. After discovering the diary, I began revisiting all the crime scenes, this time with a different perspective. It was then that I noticed something that had previously gone unnoticed. On each body, there was a mark, a number engraved on the skin, made with almost surgical precision. Always in different locations, but with the same meticulous line. As I arranged the photos on the table, the pattern jumped out at me. The numbers formed an ascending sequence. He was telling something, or someone. Forensic analysis confirmed it. The engraving was made with an extremely thin metal instrument, as if the killer wanted to avoid any smudging. It wasn't just a signature, it was part of the ritual. Each number seemed to represent a stage, a step within a larger calculation. And somehow, this counting gave me the feeling that a destiny was sealed at the end, as if the last number were the conclusion of a fatal equation. Most disturbingly, as I reviewed the dates of the deaths, I realized the intervals between them followed an almost musical rhythm, as if the killer had transformed the crime into a musical score, and each victim was a note in the rhythm of his revenge. This perverse. Harmony made me uneasy. It wasn't just about killing, it was about composing. An artist of logic, transforming pain into precision. As I watched that sequence, a nagging thought wouldn't leave me alone. What if these numbers weren't just marking victims, but leading me to a final point? A number that had yet to be recorded. A number that, perhaps, had already been reserved. That night, when I got home, there was an envelope waiting for me on my doorstep. Same format, same paper, same precise handwriting. But this time, there was no sequence of numbers, just one sentence. Not all calculations are done with numbers, John. My spine froze. The killer knew my name, and worse, he knew where I lived. The game was no longer a public challenge. Now it was personal. I sat at the table with the envelope in front of me. The paper had the same subtle scent as the previous messages, metallic notes like chemical ink. There was something cold and intimate about the message, as if he were there, watching my reaction. I picked up the magnifying glass and examined every detail. On the back, a nearly invisible line formed a coordinate, the exact location of my apartment, a cruel reminder that he was closer than ever. My instincts screamed to alert the team, but something made me hesitate. I knew that if I turned this into an operation, he'd disappear into the shadows again. He didn't want the police. He wanted my attention. So I decided to play along, cautiously, but aware that from then on, every step could be my last. I picked up the journal we'd found and returned to the marked pages. Among the calculations and symbols, a note caught my eye. When the number looks back, the cycle will be complete. I closed the notebook and stared at my reflection in the mirror. For the first time, I felt like I was being studied, not as an investigator, but as a piece of evidence. The killer knew me, perhaps better than I knew myself. And the worst part was that, deep down, I was beginning to feel that part of him existed within me, too. After that night, sleep became a luxury. Every noise in the house seemed to carry a hidden meaning. I began to live between fear and curiosity, two emotions that, together, are the most dangerous fuel an investigator can possess. I knew he was watching me. I didn't know from where or when, but I felt it. It was as if my own routine had become part of the puzzle he was piecing together with surgical patience. At some point, I began to wonder if the next target wasn't me, but someone close to me. That doubt was the kind of poison that eats away at you. I avoided personal calls, kept my distance from friends, and even from Miller, who was already noticing something strange. The more I tried to protect those around me, the more I realized the killer had isolated me without lifting a finger. He was winning without moving a single piece. The dilemma was clear: expose the game and risk further deaths, or play it silently, trying to anticipate the next move. But there was a third risk, the most dangerous. The possibility that the more I got involved, the more I'd start to think like him. Because the human mind has a limit, and the line between reasoning and obsession is thinner than it seems. One of those early mornings, I looked at the board with the photos and codes and realized something disturbing. The more I tried to decipher it, the more the patterns I saw began to include me. It was as if the killer wasn't just testing me, he was trying to transform me. I concluded that if I wanted to understand the game, I'd have to play it again. So I decided to test the killer. I created a fake code, a sequence with the same logical pattern as the previous ones, but with one subtle difference. It led nowhere. I discreetly divulged the information as if it had been intercepted. The idea was simple: watch his reaction. If he took the bait, I'd know he was watching my every move. The next few hours were silent torture. Nothing happened. No message, no signal. I began to think the plan had failed, until I received a new email with no subject line, just one sentence. "Nice try, John, but I made up the game." On the screen were the same fake coordinates I'd created. He'd detected the manipulation and sent it back with irony. The feeling of being read inside was suffocating. I spent the rest of the night trying to understand how he knew. I tried to rationalize, but fear has its own logic. If he knew the code was fake, it meant he had access to more than just my public actions. Maybe someone within the team was leaking information. From that point on, trust became a luxury I could no longer afford. I turned off the lights in my office and sat in silence, just listening to my own heart. That's when I realized the real trap wasn't in the numbers, it was in pride. And somehow, he'd already foreseen that. After the indirect confrontation, I knew something big was about to happen. The sequences began arriving more frequently, and this time with a detail that had escaped me before. Each code had 3 groups of numbers, but the last group repeated in every message. When I finally deciphered the pattern, the ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet. What I thought were coordinates were birth dates. I spent hours cross-referencing information until I realized the absurdity. All the victims had something in common, a numerical coincidence that extended all the way back to me. My own birthday appeared hidden in the most recent sequence. It was as if the killer had placed me in the series from the beginning, as the final variable in his equation. For the first time, I felt like the case wasn't about him, it was about us. I rummaged through the diary again, searching for any clue that made sense, and there it was, a page marked with the same date as my birth, accompanied by the phrase, "The origin and the end are the same number." It was no coincidence. This man was connecting me to the deaths in a symbolic way, perhaps emotionally, perhaps historically. I just didn't know how yet. I leaned my back against the wall, trying to process everything. For the first time in my career, I felt like maybe I wasn't the hunter, but the final calculation of someone who had been studying me for years. And worst of all, deep down, a part of me wanted to understand why. I returned to the files of the 10-year-old corruption case. The memories weren't good. I was still a newly promoted investigator, full of confidence and faith in the system. That case had been my first major assignment, and also my first failure. Innocent people died, evidence disappeared, and the final report was shelved before I could even understand what had happened. Now, looking at those yellowed pages, I realized what had always been there. The names of the killer's victims were the same as those in the hushed-up case. Only one name was missing from that list, his. Among the documents, I found an old, coffee-stained file with a partially torn photo. It belonged to a young engineer named Elias Morgan, a survivor of an accident caused by one of the companies investigated in that case. A name I confess I'd forgotten, until now. Elias had lost everything: family, home, future, and worst of all, I was the one who signed the report that closed the investigation due to lack of evidence. His medical record showed months of hospitalization in a psychiatric clinic, followed by a complete disappearance. No records, no news. It was as if he had vanished. But now everything made sense. Elias hadn't disappeared. He had reinvented himself. He transformed his pain into calculation and his revenge into code. Every number, every crime was retaliation for the injustice that destroyed him, and I was the last one responsible for that past. I closed the file and stared at my own reflection in the window. Suddenly, I understood that this case was never about the victims. It was about redemption, his and perhaps mine. And when truth is mixed with guilt, no one emerges unscathed. That morning, I received the last message. No text, no insults, no indecipherable code. Just a countdown flashing on the screen. 24 hours 00. A stopwatch. The caption read, "The time for truth has begun." I understood immediately. This wasn't a threat. It was the finalization of the equation. Elias was about to complete the cycle, and I was the final piece. The question was, where? I reviewed all the places marked by the previous coordinates and found a central point, a perfect intersection between all the locations, the old building where the corruption case began. There, where everything had been covered up. It was too symbolic to be a coincidence. I grabbed my badge, my gun, and my diary and went alone. It wasn't courage, it was necessity. Sometimes guilt calls us back to where it all began. When I entered the abandoned building, the dim light of a projector illuminated the main room. In the center, a chair, and on it, a simple device, the digital timer that marked the final hours. Beside it, a recording played Elias's voice. Every number was a memory, John. Every death, an answer. Now all that's left is the final result. The countdown read 00532. He had given me time, not to escape, but to understand. I searched the place for clues, but everything was too prepared, like a stage. This was where the story ended or began again. And for the first time, I realized the mystery wasn't about who would die, but about who was willing to survive the truth itself. The sound of the timer echoed through the room like a heart about to stop. Each beep seemed louder, more urgent. I looked around and noticed cables, sensors, and a small explosive charge connected to a homemade but precise system, typical of Elias. He didn't just want to blow up the building. He wanted the explosion to mean something. There was a logic to the chaos, a final enigma hidden in the numbers flashing before me. I picked up the diary and flipped desperately until I found the last entry. The end equals the beginning. The words repeated like a circular equation. I glanced at the timer, 00-120. That's when I realized the pattern. The bomb's code matched the first sequence I'd received months earlier. The message that started it all was also the key to ending the cycle. Elias had given me the solution from the beginning, like a teacher waiting for the student to figure it out on their own. My hands trembled as I punched the numbers into the panel. Each keystroke felt like it weighed a ton. 1207231945. Enter. Silence. The timer stopped at 0003. 3 seconds of life, or redemption. I fell to my knees, breathing as if air had returned. The explosion didn't come. The building remained standing. But in the center of the room, I found something even more disturbing. A photo of Elias and me, taken on the day of the old investigation. Behind the photo, a handwritten phrase, "Now you understand." And in that moment, I truly understood. He never wanted to kill me. He wanted me to remember. He wanted me to feel the same weight he carried for a decade. The game is over. But guilt? That has no off button. The sun was rising as I left that building. The city was waking up, unaware of how long it had slept amidst a minefield of truths. The death numbers case officially ended that morning, but inside me, nothing was finished. Elias Morgan was found a few hours later, dead in his apartment. The cause? An overdose of tranquilizers. Beside the body, a single note. The last number was mine. No farewell letter, no regrets. Just silence. As I watched the experts work, I felt something I hadn't expected. A cold, almost melancholic emptiness. Elias had won in the most subtle way possible. He left no trace, only reflections. I had solved the case, yes, but the question that kept echoing was another. How many mistakes had I made while searching for the truth? How many lives had been changed by my signature, a hasty report, a bad choice? I spent days rereading the diary, trying to understand if that man was a monster or just the distorted reflection of a system that failed us all. Perhaps he wasn't the enemy, but rather the mirror I avoided looking at. Justice, I realized, may be an exact calculation, but regret is an unsolvable equation. Today, I keep the first envelope in my drawer, not as evidence, but as a reminder. Because the human mind is a maze of numbers, and sometimes the real enigma lies not in the perpetrator, but in the one trying to solve it. You know, after all these years trying to understand what drives someone to cross the line between justice and madness, I've realized something. Everyone has their own numbers. Every decision, every regret, every memory, it all adds up to the final tally we call conscience. Elias Morgan made his. I made mine. And deep down, maybe the difference between us was simply the outcome we each chose to accept. The truth is, sometimes evil doesn't hide in the darkness. It dons the mask of reason, speaks calmly, and convinces you that you're doing the right thing. That's what Elias understood, and what took me a while to realize. Because the real danger isn't losing control, it's thinking you'll never lose it. Today, when I look back, I don't just see a murderer. I see a man trying to solve an impossible equation, living with guilt. And perhaps that's the true mystery of the human mind. Justice may be exact, but forgiveness never is. If you enjoyed this investigation and want to continue diving with me into stories where logic and mystery intersect, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next case has already begun.